We begin tonight with the new signs that the Justice Department is moving the ball in its investigation into the January 6th insurrection. The House January 6th committee has spent the summer laying out its laser-focused investigation into the former president's actions leading up to the attack on the Capitol. And while these hearings have been blockbuster and widely watched, if you found yourself frustrated asking, where is the accountability, you were not alone. But it's important to just keep in your mind, alongside your work worries or where your kids' socks are or what date your credit card is due and all the other real-life stuff rattling around in there, alongside fears of the end of democracy and whether your state now owns your body, that the way to understand these hearings is to remember that this committee is part of a legislative body. It cannot prosecute anybody. All it can do is investigate what happened on January 6th, 2021, record it for history, which is important, and recommend changes in law or policy to prevent another insurrection or worse. And on that score, what we're hearing is the work of the committee already informing talks in the Senate to try to reform the arcane Electoral Count Act of 1887 to ensure that no future president could try to pressure their vice president the way Trump tried to get him or her to invent fake powers to undo an election. Senator Susan Collins and Joe Manchin have taken up an effort to overhaul the law in the Senate, leading a bipartisan group of 16 senators. And I can just see the faces that y'all are making. And please know that some members of the January 6th committee are also not impressed by those generally ineffective senators' efforts and perhaps would like to go even further. The committee has also taken great steps to remind us that this was, in fact, an attempted insurrection, highlighting another option. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the Insurrection Clause, disqualifies a person from holding office if, having taken an oath to the Constitution, they engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Then there's option 3, criminal referrals to the Justice Department. Vice Chair Liz Cheney has indicated that there could be multiple referrals regarding the former president. And Attorney General Merrick Garland was asked about that in his exclusive interview with NBC's Lester Holt.
I think this is totally up to the committee. We will have the evidence that the committee has presented and whatever evidence it gives us. I don't think that the nature of how they style, the manner in which information is provided, is of particular significance from any legal point of view. We have our own investigation pursuing through the principles of prosecution.
Fast forward 24 hours, and a lot of what we've heard from the committee and what the Justice Department is pursuing now is falling into place. NBC News has confirmed that the Justice Department is looking into the former president's actions in its criminal probe into January 6th and efforts to overturn the 2020 election, trying to find out what he told his inner circle about efforts to install pro-Trump electors in states that President Biden had won, and trying to encourage Mike Pence to recognize those fake electors. NBC has also learned that investigators obtained phone records of former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows back in April, along with other top Trump aides. The Washington Post first reported these developments, noting that the DOJ investigation appears focused on two potential tracks. The first, seditious conspiracy and conspiracy to obstruct a government proceeding. And the second is potential fraud connected to the effort to submit those fake electors and to corrupt the Justice Department. Meaning that quite a lot of what we've heard in these public committee hearings is starting to converge with the DOJ investigation. For example, Greg Jacob, former chief counsel to Pence, testified to the committee last month that coup memo lawyer John Eastman's proposals to have Pence overthrow the election likely violated the Electoral Count Act. And multiple reports indicated that Jacobs testified before a grand jury recently. Meanwhile, today, the Justice Department obtained a new search warrant to access the contents of John Eastman's phone, which was seized by the FBI last month. Not long after, federal agents also searched the home of former Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Clark, also involved with encouraging those alternate electors. And while the Justice Department's scrutiny of the former president is, for now, not a criminal investigation of Trump itself, it sure does raise the prospect of something extraordinary, as no other president has been charged with a crime in all of American history. And joining me now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss, along with Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst. Thank you both for being here. And I'm going to start with you, Jill Wine-Banks, just on the knowing what you know about presidents and prosecution. And the fact that, Nixon came real close to getting prosecuted, probably would have been prosecuted had he not been pardoned by Gerald Ford. So, right, it could have been.
Should have been.
I agree with you on that. When you look, Jill, at what the Justice Department seems to be looking at, and also listening to Merrick Garland be as animated as a Merrick Garland can be, because he's not super animated, but he was, I guess that was his version of animated. How likely do you think it would be that they really will investigate Donald Trump himself for crimes related to January 6th?
I now believe that it is happening, not just that it is likely to happen. I believe it is the right thing. Michael and I had an exchange today on Twitter, and I think we both agree that Nixon should have been indicted. I fought for that when I was a special prosecutor while he was president. I do not believe that there is anything in the Constitution that exempts him, any president, from being indicted. And then certainly the day he resigned, I went back to Leon Jaworski and argued that he should be indicted right then when he was just an ordinary citizen. Donald Trump is an ordinary citizen and is committing crimes right now. And he must be stopped. I think that had Nixon been stopped, if he had not just been an unindicted co-conspirator, which is a very powerful step, it was very important. It let us use the evidence of his tapes at trial, which we couldn't have if he wasn't a co-conspirator. Right. But if he had been, one, there would have been a precedent, and we wouldn't be dithering around arguing about should it be done or shouldn't it. And secondly, maybe, just maybe, Donald Trump would have gotten a message from that he couldn't commit crimes and get away with it, and maybe he wouldn't have tried to take down our democracy. Maybe he wouldn't have attempted a coup. Maybe he wouldn't have used the big lie to rile up a crowd, to try to interfere with Congress and the vice president. I think it was important that we should have done it back then. I think it was wrong that Ford pardoned him. And I'm sympathetic to Ford's motive. I don't think he acted out of any bad motives. I think he meant well in trying to protect America. But this is the result of non-action back then. And let's not make the same mistake twice.
And Adam Kinzinger took that same argument that I know both of you agree with, because we follow you on Twitter, Michael Beschloss, so we know that you agree wholeheartedly with what we just heard. Sure. See, listen, we are like a mutual following on Twitter Admiration Society. Absolutely. But here's Adam Kinzinger basically making that same point, but then taking that point forward. Here's Adam Kinzinger.
My belief is this: we never want to get to a position in a country where we prosecute last administrations, because that's what failed republics, failed democracies do. But if a failed coup and an obvious coup attempt and a president that didn't just choose not to act but willfully watched to see where the mob would go for 3 hours on January 6th, if he is not held accountable through law, I actually fear that that is a far worse precedent than anything else. If we just wash this under the rug and say, for the sake of the country, let's put this aside, there is going to be somebody else, whether it's Donald Trump in 2024 or somebody else somewhere down the line, that recognizes that as the floor of their behavior and pushes even more. And we can't survive that.
And Michael, to that point, Donald Trump was making a speech in Washington this week where he talked about essentially a purge of all bureaucrats that he doesn't like in Washington, essentially saying he would like the power to purge governors that he doesn't like. We've already seen him use the National Guard to clear a path for him to go and hold a Bible for a photo op and use military might and force to do that, and displaying the military in a way in front of the Lincoln Memorial in June of 2020 during the George Floyd protests as sort of a show of military force. Look at that. That is the way Donald Trump thinks about power. And so I would like you to take that same thing forward, what Jill said and what Adam Kinzinger said, because this is like not a theoretical threat. It's a real threat. No. It's Donald Trump is just one of the people who could do it.
Total threat. Donald Trump is a would-be dictator, and he has been for 7 years. He's given us all sorts of signals that he would grab as much power as possible. to the point that it is fascist. You know, you were talking, Joy, about Trump promising a purge if he becomes president again. Who did the most famous purge in recent history? That was Stalin. Did not work out too well for either his country or the people who were purged. Millions of people were killed, which I'm not predicting, but who on earth would even say such a thing? In any case, just about the worst thing that any president of the United States can do is to try to use his power to wreck our democracy and take total power that goes outside of the Constitution. That's what Donald Trump did on the 6th of January. He was at the center of this coup d'etat blueprint. No president in American history, and there have been some really bad ones, including, as Jill knows, Richard Nixon, no one even attempted to come close to doing that. So if he does that and gets away with that, what does that say to him if he, God forbid, comes back in 2025 to the White House? Or another president who says, gee, Donald Trump got away with it. Richard Nixon got away with something less, so I'm just going to see if I can mobilize the 101st Airborne to intimidate people in American society to do what I want. In that case, we have a lawless society. It's absolutely essential that at least an indictment of Donald Trump be investigated, and I think the last 24 hours is nothing but good news.